Imagine you are 23 years old. You just landed a decent job in San Francisco. Your salary is $72,000 a year. You feel good. You feel like it's starting. Then you look at a one-bedroom apartment, $3,200 a month. You do the math. After taxes, your take-home is roughly $4,800 a month. Your rent alone is 66% of your income. The city hasn't even billed you for groceries, transportation, student loans, or a single drink at a bar that charges $22 for a cocktail named after a neighborhood you can't afford to live in. And here is the kicker. You are not the exception. About 67% of Gen Z adults say they struggle to cover housing costs. Not some, not a few. 2/3 of an entire generation. That number is higher than millennials at 53%, higher than Gen X at 54%, and nearly double the 36% of boomers who say the same thing. So here is the question I want you to sit with before we get into anything else. At what point does a city stop being an opportunity and start being a trap? And more importantly, at what point do the people inside the trap figure it out and just walk away? That is what is happening right now, and it is way more interesting than it looks. We are going to explain how the city pricing machine actually works, why it is expelling an entire generation, and why the people who understand the mechanism early are quietly going to end up in a completely different financial position than the people who stay out of habit, ego, or FOMO. Let me introduce the central idea I will come back to throughout this video. Think of a major expensive city as a machine. Not a bad machine, necessarily. Just a machine. It takes inputs and produces outputs. The inputs are your labor, your rent, your taxes, your spending. The outputs used to be opportunity, network density, career acceleration, and eventually equity. For a long time, the machine worked. You fed it your 20s and it handed you something on the other side. The problem is that the output side of the machine has changed. The costs of feeding it have gone up dramatically. The outputs have stayed roughly flat or declined. And the people running the machine have not adjusted the price. They don't need to. Someone is always willing to pay. So the machine just keeps running, and every generation that feeds it without reading the output data loses. Gen Z is the first generation to read the output data in real time on a phone with spreadsheets and go, no. That is the thesis. Now let's build it. The most common framing of this story is that Gen Z is broke and can't afford cities. That is a surface reading. It is partially true, but it misses the more interesting part. Because not all of Gen Z is leaving. In fact, some of them are actively moving into the most expensive cities in the country. And that tension, the ones who stay versus the ones who leave, is where the real story is. Major metropolitan areas are seeing population losses for each generation except Gen Z. The 5 largest U.S. cities, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia, all had net migration increases for Gen Z while showing major net decreases for all other generations. Let that sit for a second. Boomers are leaving. Gen X is leaving. Millennials are absolutely fleeing. More than 96,000 millennials fled New York City alone. But Gen Z is still walking in. Why? Part of it is life cycle. Young people have always moved to big cities for the early career phase. Entry-level jobs cluster there. Social networks form there. The density of opportunity is real, especially in your early 20s when you don't yet have kids, a mortgage, or a reason to care about school districts. But here is the part that matters. The Gen Z moving into these cities is not staying. They are doing a stint. A calculated deployment. They go in, extract what the machine offers, the network, the resume line, the salary bump. Then they leave. Before the machine takes more than it gave. The ones who stay too long are the ones who get stuck, and the ones getting stuck are multiplying. Approximately 90% of Gen Z say they want to own a home someday, but 62% worry they never will. Of those who think they'll never own a home, 82% say it's because they can't afford it, up from 57% who said the same in 2024. That jump from 57 to 82% in a single year is not a vibe shift. That is a system recalibrating in real time. People are updating their priors based on observed reality. That is what rational actors do when the data changes. And the data has changed. Here is what the data actually shows. Buyers still need to earn $112,000 to afford the median priced U.S. home. Roughly $25,000 more than the median U.S. income. That gap exists nationally. In the expensive coastal cities we were talking about, the gap is not $25,000. The gap is a different planet. Atlanta's median price sat at $445,000 compared to $1.499 million in Los Angeles and $1.2 million in San Francisco. Houston and Dallas came in at $385,000 and $455,000 respectively. So the machine in Los Angeles costs you roughly 3.5 times more to enter than the machine in Houston. Both machines produce jobs, both machines produce networks. The outputs are not 3.5 times better in Los Angeles. The price difference is not justified by the output difference. That is not an opinion, that is arithmetic. Now you might be thinking, okay, but the salaries in LA and San Francisco are higher too. Tech pays more on the coast, finance pays more in New York. You have to account for that. Fair. Let's account for it. Take a software engineer, entry-level, mid-tier company. In San Francisco, the salary might be $130,000. In Austin, it might be $95,000. In Nashville, $85,000 on paper. San Francisco wins. But now run the actual numbers. After California state income tax, federal tax, and the other standard deductions, that $130,000 in San Francisco becomes something closer to $82,000 in take-home pay. An average one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco runs you somewhere between $2,800 to $3,500 a month, depending on neighborhood. Call it $36,000 a year just in rent. Now you have $46,000 left for everything else in one of the most expensive cities in the world. Meanwhile, your counterpart in Nashville is taking home around $63,000 after taxes, with no state income tax. A comparable one-bedroom is $1,400 to $1,700 a month. Call it $19,000 a year. They have $44,000 left for everything else, in a city where everything costs 30 to 40% less. The San Francisco salary advantage evaporates completely. The person in Nashville actually has more usable money in a lower cost environment with a higher savings rate. The cost of living in San Francisco is 80.6% higher than in Orlando, and housing prices are 226.2% higher. That is the machine running the wrong direction. You are feeding it more and getting out less, and yet millions of people stay. Because the machine is not just financial, it is psychological, it is social, it is about identity, and we need to understand that mechanism because it is the part nobody talks about. There is a psychological trap built into expensive cities. I call it the proximity premium illusion. The idea is that being near something valuable, a prestigious firm, a famous restaurant scene, a cultural moment, makes you more valuable by association. So people pay an extraordinary premium just to be adjacent to things that sound impressive. They are not buying housing, they are buying an identity signal, and the market for identity signals is almost infinitely elastic. Imagine a guy, let's call him Marcus, 26, works in marketing in New York, makes $78,000 a year, pays $2,400 a month for a studio in Brooklyn, has $412 in savings, goes to nice bars, wears decent clothes, and confidently tells people he lives in New York. That sentence, "I live in New York," feels like it carries weight, like it means something. The city is a costume. The machine knows this. The machine prices itself accordingly. You are not just paying rent, you are paying a monthly subscription fee for the story you get to tell about yourself. Now, here is the uncomfortable reversal. You think expensive cities are the problem, but actually, the psychological dependency on the story is the problem. The city is just the product being sold. The real issue is that a significant portion of people do not move because moving feels like a demotion, even if the math is astronomically in favor of leaving. That is a behavioral trap, not a financial one. And the people who escape it first are the ones who started tracking outputs before they got attached to the inputs. If you find this kind of analysis useful, subscribe. I put out videos like this regularly. No motivation, no hustle talk, just systems thinking applied to money decisions that actually matter. Now, let's go one level deeper. Because up until now, we have been talking about the present, the money you have today, the rent you pay today, but the more damaging effect of staying in an expensive city is not the monthly cash bleed, it is the compounding cost over time. And this is where the numbers get genuinely dark. Here is a simple model. Two 24-year-olds, same background, same education. One, let's say her name is Priya, stays in Los Angeles. The other, let's call him Daniel, moves to Charlotte, North Carolina. Priya earns $110,000 in LA. She pays $3,000 a month in rent. She spends aggressively because LA rewards visible consumption. At the end of each month, she saves maybe $300. After 5 years, she has roughly $18,000 saved. She has built zero equity. She has no assets. Daniel earns $78,000 in Charlotte. He pays $1,200 a month in rent for a nicer place than Priya has. He saves around $800 a month after all expenses. But here's the difference. At month 24, Daniel has saved enough for a down payment on a $90,000 condo. He puts 8% down, takes a 30-year mortgage at 6%. His mortgage payment is $640 a month. His monthly housing cost just dropped below his previous rent. He is now building equity. By year 5, he has $31,000 in equity and roughly $14,000 in savings. His net worth is $45,000. Priya's net worth is $18,000. That is a $27,000 gap after 5 years, generated entirely by geography, not by discipline, talent, or work ethic. Both of them worked hard. Both of them made reasonable decisions within their environments. But the machines they plugged themselves into produced completely different outputs. Now extend that to 15 years. The compounding effect of early equity, reinvestment, leverage on a first property, and the lower cost base that allows for actual saving and investing, that gap does not stay at $27,000. It grows exponentially. We are talking about a potential net worth difference in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more, driven by a single geographic decision made in the mid-20s. This is not a small variable. This is the variable, and yet the dominant cultural conversation about Gen Z and money focuses on lattes, avocado toast, and spending behavior. As if discipline alone is the bottleneck. It is not. The bottleneck is structural. The machine is the problem. And moving off the machine is the highest leverage financial move available to most people in their 20s. Here is a quick cutaway for you. Picture a 25-year-old staying in San Francisco, splitting a 2-bedroom with 2 strangers, spending 40% of take-home on rent, telling himself it is fine because of the culture. He opens his phone and reads a tweet from a guy his age in Raleigh who just bought a house. He closes Twitter. He opens Instagram. He posts a photo of the Golden Gate Bridge. He feels better. He pays rent. The machine continues to run. Now let's go deeper again, because this is where the story gets actually strange. We said that Gen Z is unique. Unlike every other living generation, they are still moving into expensive cities. But the research shows something more specific than that. Because they have the least financial slack, no relocation packages, and little tolerance for inefficiency, they only move when a city removes enough barriers to make early adulthood viable. When Gen Z shows up in a zip code, it's often not because it's trendy, but because the math finally works for them. That is a fascinating sentence. Gen Z moves are math-driven, not trend-driven, not status-driven. The zip codes they choose are selected based on viability calculations, whether consciously or not. They are running cost-benefit analyses that previous generations never ran at the same age, because previous generations could afford not to. But here is the part that complicates the narrative. Even though some Gen Z is flowing into cities, the data shows something different happening at a structural level. The cities that Gen Z is moving into are not the same cities that made millennials. The destinations are shifting. Cities like Nashville and Orlando are now legitimate contenders in the innovation economy. Gen Z has been flocking to more affordable cities just to get by during the cost of living crisis. Aside from places like Texas and Florida, many have made moves to the Midwest, where homes are about 30% cheaper than on the coasts. 7 of the 10 most accessible metros for young homeowners are in the Midwest. So the pattern is this. Some Gen Z goes to expensive cities for the early career phase. Many others skip that phase entirely and go straight to affordable cities with legitimate job markets. And the second group is building wealth faster, because they stepped off the machine before the machine could extract them. Cities like Nashville and Orlando are now legitimate contenders in the innovation economy. This is important. The old argument for staying in an expensive city was that you had to be there to access the best jobs. That argument is eroding. Companies have moved, remote work normalized. The premium for physical proximity to a major market is declining in many industries, while the cost of that proximity has stayed the same or increased. The machine is charging you the old price for an output that is worth less than it used to be. This is what I mean when I say Gen Z is the first generation to read the output data clearly. They did not grow up with the mythology of the city the way boomers did, the way even millennials did. They grew up with a phone in their hand, a spreadsheet on their laptop, and a TikTok algorithm that delivers financial horror stories at scale. They see the math, and increasingly, they refuse to pay. Nearly half of Gen Z believe homeownership is so far out of reach that there's no point in trying to save now. That is a stunning number. Not because it means Gen Z is giving up, but because it means the machine has broken the fundamental incentive structure that powered previous generations. When you can no longer see a plausible path to the standard asset base, you stop behaving in accordance with the standard script. You start optimizing for something else. And what do people optimize for when they cannot optimize for traditional wealth accumulation? Freedom of movement, low fixed costs, optionality, the ability to leave. These are the financial characteristics of geographic arbitrage, which is functionally what relocating from an expensive city to a cheaper one is. It is arbitrage. You are selling an overpriced input, your labor and presence, out of a market where it is mispriced and redeploying it in a market where your purchasing power is higher. Now let me walk you through 4 levels of how this actually plays out in practice, because I think there is a framework here that is worth naming clearly. Level 1 is the person who stays. They pay the machine. They build no equity, they might have a great career and a strong network, but their net worth at 40 looks nothing like someone with similar income who made different geographic choices at 24. The machine extracted them. They fed it their most productive years and got resume lines and brunch photos in return. Level 2 is the person who leaves the expensive city but does not understand why. They move to Austin or Nashville because it seems cooler, cheaper, more livable. They replicate many of the same spending behaviors. They spend what they save on rent on going out, a nicer car, a lifestyle upgrade. They arbitrage their cost base, but they do not deploy the savings strategically. They end up ahead of level 1, but not dramatically. The machine they left has been replaced by a slightly smaller machine. Level 3 is the person who leaves and immediately converts their lower cost base into assets. Lower rent means surplus cash flow. Surplus cash flow means a down payment within 18 to 30 months. A down payment means equity. Equity means leverage for the next purchase. This person is not just arbitraging their cost of living, they are using the arbitrage to build a compounding asset base. This person ends up in a radically different financial position in 10 years. Level 4 is the person who understands that the geographic arbitrage is a one-time window. The cities that are cheap today are getting discovered. Nashville ranked among the top 5 U.S. markets for office absorption in 2025, with 35% of new supply absorbed. Property values are rising, the arbitrage closes over time. So level 4 is the person who gets into the cheap market early, builds equity during the appreciation phase, and captures the geographic premium as it normalizes. They bought Nashville before Nashville became expensive. They bought Raleigh, they bought Charlotte. They are now sitting on assets that have appreciated significantly, while their peers in San Francisco are still renting studios at $3,000 a month. Level 4 is not a secret strategy, it is just pattern recognition applied early. The question is whether you recognize the pattern while the window is still open. Here is the second comedic cutaway. Picture a city planner in Los Angeles standing in front of a PowerPoint slide at a housing conference. The slide says, "Solution: build 500 new affordable units by 2029. Someone in the audience raises their hand and says, "There are 440,000 people on the waiting list for affordable housing in this city." The city planner clicks to the next slide. It says, Phase 2, anyway. Let's talk about the other side of this equation, because there is a second order effect here that most people are not thinking about, and it is the most counterintuitive part of this entire story. When lower income residents leave an expensive city, the natural assumption is that the city becomes more accessible over time. Supply and demand. Fewer people competing for the same housing means lower prices, right? Here is the problem with that assumption. The people leaving are disproportionately lower earners. The people staying either because they have the wealth to absorb the costs or because they are locked into equity positions they cannot unwind are disproportionately high earners. So the average income of the remaining population goes up. Local businesses reprice to serve that population. Services, restaurants, retail, maintenance costs all adjust upward. The neighborhood ecosystem shifts its pricing to match the new demographic, and the city does not become more affordable as poor people leave. It becomes more expensive. because it is now optimized for the people who remain. This is a feedback loop with no natural break. The more lower income people leave, the higher the average income of the remaining pool, the more the city reprices for that pool, the more expensive it becomes, the more lower income people leave. You are watching a machine run itself to equilibrium at a price point that excludes the bottom half of the income distribution permanently. As stagnant job growth and persistently high inflation squeeze renters from both sides, the 10 most expensive cities come with price tags that feel out of touch with real-world paychecks. Today's mix of limited supply, high income demand, and slow construction continues to push them out of reach for many Americans. This is not a housing problem. This is a structural repricing problem. And no amount of affordable housing policy has shown the capacity to outrun it. The housing affordability crisis has transformed from a cyclical market challenge into a generational mobility barrier. The persistent inconsistencies between housing market supply and demand, compounded by soaring rents, restrictive zoning, and stagnant real wages, has pushed homeownership further out of reach. The machine is not broken. The machine is working exactly as designed. It is just that the design was never meant to serve people who do not already have capital. Now here is where it gets interesting from a wealth building perspective. And this is the part I want you to think about carefully because it reframes the entire conversation. The cities that are currently cheap are cheap precisely because they have not yet been discovered by the capital flows that reprice the coastal markets. But here is the signal that tells you they are about to be discovered. Young, educated workers are moving there in significant numbers. When Gen Z shows up in a zip code, it's often not because it's trendy, but because the math finally works for them. Their movement patterns act as an early indicator of which cities have removed enough friction to compete for long-term talent. Think about what that means as a signal. Gen Z migration patterns are a leading indicator of which cities are going to appreciate, because Gen Z moves rationally, as we established. They are not moving for status. They are moving for viability, and viable cities where a young worker can actually build a life, attract employers, attract development. And development means appreciation, and appreciation means that the person who moved there early is sitting on something valuable. 38.3% of 28-year-old Gen Zers owned their home in 2025. Compared to 42.5% of Gen Xers when they were 28 and 44.4% of Boomers when they were 28. That is a consistent downward trend across generations. Each successive generation owns fewer homes at the same age. Why? Because each successive generation entered a market where prices were higher relative to income. The math got worse every decade. But here's the other side of that data. The Gen Zers who do own at 28 are overwhelmingly not living in San Francisco or New York. They moved, they read the output data, they stepped off the machine. Home ownership remains a priority for state-to-state movers, with nearly 39% purchasing a home within their first year after relocating. 39% buying within a year. That is not coincidental. That is the whole point of the move. You leave the machine, you immediately convert the cost savings into an asset. That is the playbook. And one more thing before we talk about what to actually do with all of this. Let's talk about the psychological reframe that makes the move possible. Because the biggest barrier for most people is not financial. It is the story they tell themselves about what the move means. When someone from a city decides to move to a smaller market, there is a social cost. Their peer group, often also locked into the city machine, perceives the move as a downgrade, a retreat, a giving up. The city mythology runs deep. It says that the ambitious people stay, fight, grind, make it work. And the people who leave are the ones who couldn't hack it. This is complete nonsense, but it is a powerful narrative because it is emotionally loaded. And the machine benefits from it. Every person who stays because they are afraid of being perceived as someone who left is another month of rent payment flowing into the machine. A striking 84% of Gen Z aspiring homeowners report delaying major life decisions until they can afford a home. That includes the move. They are waiting for the city to become affordable instead of moving to a city that already is. The machine has convinced them that the solution is patience rather than geography. And patience in this context is just a slower form of extraction. The reframe is this. Moving is not a retreat. Moving is capital reallocation. You are taking the most productive asset you have, your time and labor in your 20s, and deploying it where it generates the highest real return. A financial advisor would call that portfolio optimization, but when someone does it with their geography, we call it giving up on the city. The language is designed to make you feel bad about making a rational decision. Do not let the language work on you. Now let's pull all of this together into 3 practical things you can actually do with this framework. Not motivation, not inspiration, just structure. The first one is this: run your city's math before you run your career math. Most people optimize first for job quality and salary and then figure out the housing situation as an afterthought. Reverse that, start with the housing equation. What does it cost to actually live here? What is my realistic take home after taxes? What is the gap between my rent and what a mortgage payment would be somewhere else? What is my projected savings rate at this cost base? If your projected savings rate in your current city is under 10% of take home after rent and basic expenses, you are feeding the machine more than it is feeding you. That is your number, not the salary line. The savings rate. The second one is this: track the migration signal, not the hype cycle. The cities that are going to appreciate over the next decade are the ones currently attracting young, educated mobile workers who are not moving for trend but for viability. Cities like Nashville and Orlando are now legitimate contenders in the innovation economy. That was not true 10 years ago. The window to enter those markets cheaply has narrowed, but there are still cities in that position today. The Midwest has 7 of the 10 most accessible housing markets for young buyers right now. Most of those cities are not trending on Instagram. That is how you know the window is still open. The third one is this: understand that the move is only as valuable as what you do with the savings. Geographic arbitrage without asset conversion is just a cheaper lifestyle. It feels better, but it does not build compounding wealth. The mechanism is lower rent leads to higher savings rate, leads to faster down payment accumulation, leads to equity, leads to leverage, leads to a second property or significant investment. If you move to a cheaper city and you just spend the difference, you have arbitraged your cost of living and nothing else. You have upgraded your present and done nothing for your future. The move needs to be immediately paired with a deployment decision. Where is the savings going? Into what? On what timeline? If you cannot answer that before you move, you will arrive in the cheaper city and the machine will find you anyway. It is smaller there, but it still runs. We started this by talking about a 23-year-old feeding 66% of their income to a city that wasn't giving much back. That is not bad luck. That is a machine doing exactly what machines do, extracting inputs without being asked to justify the outputs. The generation currently refusing to stay in cities they can't afford is not a generation in crisis. It is a generation that started reading the receipts. They are the first cohort in decades to reject the machine loudly enough that the machine is starting to notice. Miami and Los Angeles topped the list as the cities with the largest population loss year over year in absolute terms in the fourth quarter of 2025. The machine is running lower on inputs. That is not a social trend, that is a feedback signal. The question for you is not whether the machine is unfair, the question is whether you are still standing in line to feed it. If this is the kind of thinking you want more of, subscribe. One click. I'll be here.